The sun dimmed behind the ragged outline of Earth's once proud cities, casting an eerie glow over the desolate landscape. Captain Kalen stood at the edge of what was left of the planet's largest spaceport, the wind tugging at his coat as he watched the last remnants of humanity's home fade into the distance. It had been years since Earth had become nothing more than a shell of its former self. No wars, no politics, just the quiet death of a world unable to stop the inevitable. "Ready to go, Captain." A voice broke through the silence, pulling Kalen from his reverie. He turned to find Lieutenant Mara, his second-in-command, approaching. Her face was as cold as the metal of the ship behind her, yet there was something in her eyes, a flicker of doubt, perhaps fear. "We can't stay," Kalen replied, his voice steady but with a weight that spoke of countless losses. He nodded toward the ship, the Phoenix, an old battered vessel that had been patched together from the scraps of long-dead fleets. It was humanity's last hope. Mara hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, her gaze flicking to the horizon. "You think we can really reignite the stars?" Kalen didn't answer immediately. He had asked himself that very question every day since they had received the mission. The universe was dying, a slow, agonizing death. The stars that once illuminated the vast reaches of space were fading, one by one. Whole sectors of the galaxy had gone dark, entire civilizations extinguished in the blink of an eye. The dark tide, an ancient and mysterious force that thrived in the absence of light, was moving through the universe, consuming everything in its path. If humanity was to survive, they needed to restore the light. But that meant finding the legendary celestial relics, artifacts capable of reigniting the stars. And those relics were scattered across forgotten, dangerous worlds. "We have no choice," Kalen finally answered. "The relics are out there, Mara. We have to find them before the dark tide does." She nodded, though her expression was uncertain. "And if we don't find them, what happens then?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Kalen didn't need to say it. They all knew that if they failed, the universe would be lost forever. Humanity, the last species with the knowledge and will to fight, would fade into extinction. They would become nothing more than a memory, if even that. As the crew of the Phoenix boarded the ship, Kalen surveyed his team, each one a warrior in their own right. There was Mara, brilliant and tactical, though haunted by her past. Sergeant Calder, the muscle of the group, a giant of a man with a heart that was both fiercely loyal and capable of incredible rage. Dr. Lyra, the ship's scientist whose vast knowledge about the ancient civilizations could be their greatest asset or their greatest liability, depending on the truth she uncovered. And then there was Callan, worn, weathered, but determined to carry the weight of humanity's future on his shoulders. The ship's engines hummed to life, its scared hull shuddering as the last remnants of Earth's atmosphere gave way to the vacuum of space. As the ship broke free from the planet's gravity, Kalen took one last glance at the fading world behind them. "Set course for the Gyrus Nebula," he commanded, voice resolute. "The first relic is waiting for us there. Let's make it count." With that, the Phoenix turned away from Earth, heading into the unknown. The universe was dying. But as long as humanity had breath, they would fight to the end. And so the last crusade began. The stars outside the Phoenix were distant, cold pinpricks of light in a vast and empty expanse. The crew moved through the ship like ghosts, each wrapped in their own thoughts, the silence between them thick and heavy. The mission to find the relics had already proven more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. Their first destination, the Gyrus Nebula, was nothing more than a graveyard of collapsed stars and forgotten debris, the perfect hiding place for the first celestial artifact they sought. The crew had spent days scanning the region, searching for anything that might point them to the relic. But so far, the only thing they had found were dead worlds and drifting wrecks. Every failure felt like a hammer blow to their already fragile morale. As Callan sat in the command chair, staring out at the endless void, He felt the weight of responsibility press down on him. He wasn't just the captain of a ship, he was the leader of the last hope for humanity. The pressure was suffocating. Every decision he made could be the one that doomed them all. "Captain," Mara's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to face her. She stood in the doorway, her posture rigid, but her eyes filled with something darker, distrust, maybe even fear. "We need to talk," she said, her tone low. Kaelin gestured for her to sit. "What's on your mind?" Mara hesitated before stepping inside, her gaze flicking briefly to the darkened view screen before locking onto him. "I've been going through the ship's logs," she began. "Something doesn't add up. We're being followed." Kaelin raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Mara's expression tightened. "The dark tide. I think they've been tracking us since we left Earth." The mention of the dark tide sent a chill through Kaelin. The malevolent force that had been consuming everything in its path was far more than just a shadow in the galaxy. It was intelligent, aware, and now, apparently, hunting them. He had suspected that they were being hunted, but to hear Mara say it out loud made it all too real. "How do you know?" Kaelin asked, his voice calm, but his mind racing. "I've been monitoring their movements," she replied, pulling up a holographic display of their ship's sensors. "We're not just dealing with random cosmic anomalies. Every time we change course, their signals shift too. It's too precise, too calculated." A sudden unease settled over Kaelin. If the dark tide was truly following them, they were walking into a trap. "We need to accelerate our search," he said, standing up. "We can't afford to wait around and let them get ahead." Mara shook her head. "It's not just that. I've noticed something else, something that might be more dangerous than the dark tide." Kaelin frowned. "What do you mean?" Mara took a breath, clearly struggling with the words. "It's Calder. He's been acting strange. I found traces of data in the ship's communications logs that shouldn't be there. Messages sent to the dark tide, encrypted but unmistakable. Someone on this ship is betraying us." Kaelin's heart sank. Sergeant Calder had always been a loyal soldier, one of the few who seemed unaffected by the chaos of the universe's collapse. But the evidence was undeniable. He could no longer ignore the possibility that one of their own was playing a dangerous game. "Are you sure?" Kaelin asked, his voice low. Mara nodded, her jaw clenched in frustration. "I don't know how deep this goes, but I'm not the only one who's noticed it. Dr. Lyra is suspicious too. We need to confront him before it's too late." Kaelin's mind raced. If there was a traitor among them, it would destroy their already fractured unity. The crew was hanging on by a thread, and a betrayal now could cost them everything. "We'll handle it together," Kaelin said, his voice hardening with resolve. "I'll confront him. Get the others ready. We leave for the next system in 2 hours. No more distractions." Mara nodded, but there was a lingering hesitation in her eyes. "Be careful, Captain. Calder's a wild card. If he's working with the dark tide, we might not get the answers we need, but we have to be ready for the worst." Kaelin looked at her for a long moment, feeling the weight of her warning settle deep in his chest. The stakes had just been raised. They were no longer just fighting to save the universe. They were fighting against the very people they trusted. As Mara left to prepare, Kaelin looked out into the cold expanse of space once more. The dark void beyond the Phoenix seemed even more ominous now, as if it was watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. And in the silence, Kaelin couldn't shake the feeling that the true battle was only just beginning. The uneasy silence that had settled over the Phoenix in the wake of Mara's revelation grew even heavier. Kaelin could feel it, a quiet tension that thrummed through the ship's walls and into the very bones of its crew. Trust, once fragile, had begun to crack, but there was no time to dwell on it. The mission continued, and the next stop on their desperate search was a war-torn planet known as Ashera, home to the Infernal Forge, a relic said to have the power to craft weapons capable of reigniting dying stars. As the Phoenix made its descent toward Ashera's surface, Kalen stood at the helm, staring at the planet below. It was a scorched world, its surface marked by endless battles fought long before humanity had ever arrived. A place of ruin and rebirth, where the very air crackled with the remnants of ancient conflict. "Captain, we're entering the atmosphere," Mara's voice came over the comms. "Brace for impact. The storm's picking up." Kalen nodded, his gaze unwavering. "All hands, prepare for landing. We can't afford to waste time." The ship bucked and groaned as they descended, the storm outside intensifying, winds howling like a chorus of spirits lost to time. Ashera's surface was a labyrinth of jagged mountains and shattered plains, a relic of a war long past. Somewhere in the heart of this wasteland lay the Infernal Forge, an ancient construct capable of crafting weapons from pure starfire, a tool that could reignite the stars if they could reach it in time. Once on the ground, the crew disembarked, their boots sinking into the ashen soil. The air was thick with the scent of burnt ozone, and the distant echo of thunder rattled the heavens above them. Kalen's eyes scanned the horizon. There was no sign of life, no movement save the swirling dust and debris. It was as if Ashera itself was holding its breath. "Stay alert," Kalen commanded, leading the team into the wilderness. "We don't know what's waiting for us here." The terrain was treacherous, with sharp cliffs and hidden pits that threatened to swallow them whole. They moved cautiously, each step calculated, aware of the danger that lurked in every shadow. As they neared the location of the forge, the air seemed to grow heavier, the storm's fury intensifying with each passing moment. The journey led them to the ruins of an ancient city, its towering spires reduced to rubble. In the center of the city stood the forge, a massive structure of twisted metal and energy conduits, pulsing with the same strange energy that powered the ancient star forges of the gods. The forge was surrounded by a field of jagged crystal formations, the remnants of a war that had ravaged the planet centuries ago. "It's here," Dr. Lyra said, her voice filled with awe and trepidation. "The forge still works, but it's unstable." Kalen approached cautiously, studying the structure. The forge hummed with a low, guttural vibration, as though it was alive, waiting. But as they moved closer, the ground trembled beneath their feet, and an ear-splitting roar echoed through the ruins. The ground cracked open, and from the depths of Ashera's tortured surface, monstrous figures emerged. Warriors clad in blackened armor, their faces hidden behind faceless helmets. They were once human, Kalen realized, but had been twisted by the destructive power of Ashera's wars. The mutations were grotesque, their bodies growing unnatural appendages, their eyes glowing with the same eerie light that suffused the forge. "The forged ones," Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "The guardians of the forge. They're not just protectors, they're products of it. Weapons born of the very energy the forge was meant to create." Before anyone could respond, the forged ones charged, their movements unnervingly fast, despite their massive frames. Calder, his face hardened by the betrayal still lingering in his mind, raised his weapon and fired. The first of the creatures crumpled under the blast, but more took its place, seemingly unfazed by the onslaught. "We need to move," Kalen shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. "To the forge, now." The crew fought back fiercely, pushing through the oncoming assault, but it quickly became clear that the forged ones were relentless. For every one they struck down, two more seemed to appear from the surrounding ruins. It wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a race against time. The forge was their only hope of creating the weapons they needed to fight the dark tide, but it was quickly becoming a tomb. Mara ducked beneath a sweeping strike from one of the forged ones, rolling to the side and firing at its exposed underbelly. "We can't keep this up," she gasped. "We need to get to the forge and activate it now, or we'll be overwhelmed." Kalen nodded grimly. He could feel the walls closing in, could feel the weight of humanity's survival pressing down on him. With a deep breath, he made his decision. "We're splitting up. Mara, take Calder and Lyra to the forge. I'll hold off the creatures. Go." Mara hesitated, but there was no time for doubt. She nodded and sprinted toward the forge, her team close behind her. Kalen turned to face the oncoming horde, his pulse quickening as the forged ones charged again, their roars deafening in the storm. This was it. They had no choice but to succeed. With one final battle ahead of him, Kalen gripped his weapon and prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice if it meant ensuring the success of humanity's last hope. The fate of the universe rested on what happened next. Kalen's breath came in ragged gasps as he fired again and again into the oncoming wave of forged ones. His weapon's blasts lit up the darkness, but for every one he felled, 2 more replaced it. The twisted warriors were relentless, their bodies a grotesque amalgamation of ancient war technology and biological terror, created by the very energy that had powered Ashera's destructive past. The Phoenix was a long way off, and the storm made their communications unreliable. But Kalen knew that Mara, Lyra, and Calder would be moving toward the forge by now. He couldn't let them down. He couldn't fail again. The ground trembled beneath his feet as a massive forged one, easily twice his size, charged at him with bone-crushing speed. Kalen barely had time to leap out of the way, rolling to his feet just as the creature's clawed hand smashed into the ground where he had been standing a second before. The shockwave knocked him off balance, but he quickly recovered, firing at the beast's exposed throat. The shot landed true, but it only staggered the creature, which roared in fury before swiping at him again. This time, Kalen wasn't fast enough. The creature's massive claw caught him across the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. His armor was dented and cracked, but it held, saving him from what would have been a fatal blow. He gasped for air, pain lancing through him as he struggled to regain his footing. A second forged one closed in on him, and Kalen gritted his teeth, ready for the final blow. But before it could land, a burst of gunfire rang out, and the creature collapsed, its head exploding in a cloud of blood and mechanical debris. Kalen looked up to see Calder standing over him, his weapon raised high. The big sergeant grinned, but there was something wrong in his eyes, a coldness that hadn't been there before. "Get up, Captain," Calder grunted. "We can't keep playing hero forever." Kalen, still winded, managed a weak nod, pulling himself up with the help of his teammate. "Where's Mara?" "Already at the forge," Calder replied, though his eyes lingered on the body of the fallen creature, his hand tightening around his weapon. "We should go after her." Kalen didn't have time to question the sudden change in Calder's demeanor. The storm was growing fiercer, and they were running out of time. Without another word, the 2 of them sprinted toward the ruins of the forge, leaving behind the chaos of the battlefield. Inside the heart of the ruined city, the forge loomed, its pulsating energy beckoning them forward. Mara, Lyra, and Calder had already reached it, their figures outlined against the glowing core of the structure. Mara was crouched in front of a massive terminal, her fingers flying over the ancient interface, while Lyra studied the structure's layout with caution, her eyes darting nervously between the surroundings and the terminal's readings. Calder stood guard, his weapon held loosely at his side, but his gaze sharp, watching for any signs of movement. "We've got a problem," Mara muttered, her voice tense. "The forge is locked. The system's fried." "What do you mean, fried?" Kalen asked, catching up with them. He stood beside Mara, eyeing the terminal she was working on. "Isn't it just a matter of flipping a switch?" Mara shook her head, frustration evident in her expression. "It's not that simple. The forge was designed to protect itself from being misused. It requires 3 separate activation codes to power it up, each tied to a key we don't have access to. This terminal can read one of the codes, but only if the other 2 are activated remotely." Lyra, who had been studying the energy signatures emanating from the forge, turned to them. "If we don't get those codes, we can't activate it. And if we don't reactivate the forge in the next hour, the dark tide will have already reached this system, and this relic will be lost forever. Then we need to get those codes, Kalen said, his voice low but firm. Mara, get to work on this terminal. Lyra, Calder, we need to find the other two. Fast. The team scattered, each taking their assignment without hesitation. Kalen led the way to the nearby ruins, his mind racing as he processed the odds. The forge was their only hope. Without it, the dark tide would consume them, and humanity, without a fight. They had to do this. They had to. Kalen and Calder moved quickly through the ruins, searching for any sign of the other activation keys. The further they pushed into the ruins, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Ashera's storm intensified with each step, its fury like the dying breath of a planet that had known only destruction. As they reached the farthest edge of the forge's surroundings, Calder stopped suddenly, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the area. He looked back at Kalen, a strange glint in his eyes. "Wait," he said quietly. "There's something here." Before Kalen could respond, Calder pulled ahead, his footsteps quicker, more purposeful. Kalen's heart skipped a beat. Something felt wrong. But it was too late. Calder stopped at a cracked piece of stone, bending to examine a hidden compartment buried beneath debris. A low hum filled the air, and Kalen's stomach turned. Something was very wrong about this. As Calder reached down to retrieve the key, Kalen saw it. Calder's hand was shaking, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Then, before Kalen could move, a sudden blinding flash of light exploded from the compartment. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and everything went black. The explosion was deafening. Kalen's ears rang as the world around him erupted in chaos. He felt a searing heat blast through him, and his body was thrown backward, crashing into the jagged remains of a broken wall. His vision blurred, the aftershocks of the blast rattling his consciousness. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The air had been blasted from his lungs, and his chest tightened painfully as he struggled to sit up. His armor had absorbed much of the impact, but the damage was severe. His head spun, and his mind raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. "Calder," he shouted, pushing himself to his feet. His voice was hoarse, and the words felt foreign in his throat, like the sound of a distant echo. The storm outside seemed to grow even fiercer, as if the planet itself was reacting to the disaster. There was no response. Kalen staggered forward, his vision slowly clearing as he made his way toward the ruined section where Calder had been standing. Dust and debris choked the air, but amidst the haze, he saw a figure, Calder, still kneeling beside the compartment, though now he was unmoving. "Calder," Kalen repeated, his voice sharp with urgency. The surgeon's eyes fluttered open, but there was something in his gaze that Kalen had never seen before, something cold and calculating. Calder's lips curled into a grim smile, but it wasn't one of camaraderie or relief. It was the smile of a man who had been playing a different game all along. "You're too late, Captain," Calder said, his voice low and mocking, though he was still breathing heavily from the blast. "You should have seen it coming." Kalen's blood ran cold. The realization hit him like a fist to the chest. The key, the activation code. Calder had been the one who had triggered the trap. "Betrayer," Kalen growled, his voice full of venom. He took a step forward, but Calder slowly rose to his feet, his stance casual, as if nothing had changed. "I didn't betray you, Kalen," Calder said, his grin widening. "I just made the only choice that mattered. You were too blinded by your ideals to see it. The dark tide is coming, but I've already secured my place with them. This forge, this relic, it's nothing. What I've found, what I've gained, will ensure that I stand at the top when everything collapses." Kalen's fists clenched, his mind reeling. He had known something was off about Calder, but this was beyond anything he had expected. His former comrade had not only sided with the dark tide, he had actively helped to sabotage the mission. "You're working with them?" Kalen asked, his voice barely a whisper. The weight of the words was too heavy to process. "You're a traitor, Calder." Calder's laugh was hollow, devoid of any real humor. "No, Captain, I'm a survivor. The dark tide has a place for me, places for people like me. You'll be a footnote in history, a forgotten relic of the old world. But me, I'll be part of the new order." Callan's mind raced. The realization that he had been deceived so completely was staggering. But there was no time to waste on regret. The dark tide had already begun their invasion, and now, with Calder's betrayal, they were more dangerous than ever. Callan didn't wait. He drew his weapon, aiming it squarely at Calder's chest. The sight of his former friend, now an enemy, made his stomach churn, but there was no other choice. "You're going to pay for this," Callan said, his voice low and dangerous. Calder raised his hands, mockingly surrendering. "Go ahead, shoot me. But remember this, Callan, you can't win this war on your own. You'll fall just like the others. I'm the one who's in control now." But before Callan could pull the trigger, a voice crackled through his comms, the transmission faint and distorted. "Callan, do you copy?" It was Mara. He quickly activated the comms, his heart pounding. "Mara, I need you to get here now." "Calder, he's betrayed us. We need to regroup fast." There was a moment of silence before Mara's voice came back, her tone tight with worry. "I hear you, Captain. We're on our way. But there's something else. The forge, it's not just a weapon. It's a beacon. The dark tide, they know we're here. They're already coming." Callan's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just Calder. The dark tide had been one step ahead all along. "Stay sharp," Callan said, trying to steady his breath. "Get to the forge and get the codes activated. I'll deal with Calder. We can't let the dark tide get to it first." As Callan turned his weapon on Calder, the betrayal stung more than the pain in his chest. Calder had been a soldier, a brother in arms. Now he was nothing more than a tool of the very force that had already destroyed so much. But Callan had no time to dwell on what could have been. With one final, resolute breath, he fired. The battle for humanity's future had just taken a dark turn, and Callan knew that even if he killed Calder, it might already be too late. The shot rang out, shattering the tense silence that had fallen between Callan and Calder. The surgeon's body crumpled to the ground in a lifeless heap, his smug expression wiped away in an instant. But the satisfaction of the kill was fleeting. Callan's heart was still pounding in his chest, the weight of the betrayal settling heavily on him. This isn't over yet. The dark tide was coming. They hadn't just attacked Ashera, they had set a trap that had ensnared not only Callan's crew, but also their last hope. The forge, once their salvation, had now become a beacon to the very enemy they had been trying to avoid. Callan didn't wait to reflect any longer. He rushed toward the forge, his feet pounding against the cracked earth, his mind focused only on the mission. Mara and Lyra would be at the terminal, trying to activate the forge, but with the dark tide on their heels, they would need more than just codes, they would need time. Time they no longer had. As he approached the center of the ruined city, the familiar glow of the forge's pulsing energy illuminated the dark landscape. But the storm around them had intensified. The air was thick with electricity, and the skies above churned with dark clouds, flashing with lightning. The storm was not just a natural occurrence. It was a sign of the power now awakening within the forge. Mara and Lyra were waiting at the terminal, both of them tense as they worked to decode the system. Their faces were grim, sweat glistening on their foreheads as they fought against time and the forces pressing in on them. "Mara," Callan shouted, breaking into a run. "We don't have much time. We need to move now." Mara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with realization. "Callan, the dark tide, they're already here. The forge is sending out a signal. It's—" Before she could finish, a thunderous roar echoed through the ruins, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. Callan barely managed to stay on his feet as the earth cracked and split wide open. disgorging the first wave of the Dark Tide's forces. They were fast, too fast, and their presence was a suffocating force, as if the very air had turned against them. Kalen raised his weapon, firing at the first few enemies that emerged from the smoke, but they were already on the move, closing in on their position. "Mara, hurry!" Kalen shouted again, his voice filled with urgency. "You have to activate the forge now. We can't hold them off for long." Mara's hands flew across the terminal, the screen flashing with lines of incomprehensible code. "I'm trying, but there's a secondary encryption. It's blocking me." "We don't have time," Lyra shouted, her voice frantic. "If we don't get this working in the next few minutes, we'll lose everything." Kalen turned toward the oncoming enemy, his heart racing. The Dark Tide soldiers were unlike anything he'd faced before, each one a hulking mass of corrupted flesh and dark energy, their eyes glowing with malice. They were unstoppable. Without thinking, Kalen charged forward, his weapon blazing as he took down one after another. But for every soldier he killed, more appeared from the swirling chaos of the storm. He felt the weight of the battle pressing down on him, felt the crushing truth that they were fighting a losing war. Every moment they spent fighting now meant one less chance to stop the coming annihilation. "Kalen," Mara called again, her voice now strained with desperation. "The forge, it's almost ready, but I need the last code. It's located in the heart of the city, at the base of the old temple. If you can get it." Kalen didn't need to hear any more. He didn't have to ask. He turned on his heel, running toward the distant ruins of the temple. The storm raged around him, but he pushed forward, the adrenaline fueling every step. Behind him, he could hear the cries of battle, the frantic gunfire as Mara and Lyra fought to buy him the time he needed. The temple was at the center of the ruins, a massive structure that had once been a place of worship. Now it was a hollowed-out shell, its walls cracked and its pillars shattered by the wars of the past. At the heart of the ruins lay a set of ancient doors, glowing with a faint, eerie light. He approached cautiously, feeling the weight of history and power pressing down on him. The final key to the forge's activation lay just beyond these doors, but the Dark Tide had anticipated this. As Kalen stepped inside, he saw them, two figures cloaked in the black armor of the Dark Tide. They were waiting for him. Their presence filled the chamber with an overwhelming sense of dread. "Did you really think you could stop us?" One of them spoke, his voice a cold whisper that echoed through the chamber. Kalen's hand tightened around his weapon. "I'm not here to stop you. I'm here to end this." Without warning, he charged forward, firing at the first of the soldiers, but the figure seemed to vanish into the shadows, reappearing in a blur. The second soldier was faster, striking out with a blade of pure energy, forcing Kalen to retreat. The battle was on. The Dark Tide would not let him take the key without a fight. And with every second that ticked by, the storm outside grew more intense. The forge's pulse was getting stronger, and with it, the promise of a new war, one that Kalen was determined to stop at any cost. The air inside the temple was thick with tension as Kalen fought to stay on his feet. The Dark Tide soldiers were relentless, moving with a speed and precision that made them seem more like shadows than flesh and bone. His weapon spat bursts of fire, but the figures danced around his shots, their movements impossibly swift. Kalen gritted his teeth, keeping his eyes fixed on his enemies. He could not afford to lose focus, not now. The last key was within reach, and with it, humanity's final chance to defend itself from the coming storm. But first, he had to survive this fight. The soldier in front of him, tall, clad in dark armor, with a crimson visor obscuring his face, lunged forward with a blindingly fast strike. Kalen barely had time to parry with his own weapon, the force of the blow vibrating through his arms. He stumbled back, but before he could regain his footing, the second soldier appeared behind him, aiming a glowing energy blade at his back. Kalen spun, barely avoiding the strike as he launched himself into a roll. putting distance between himself and the attackers. His heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to give in to fear. They were powerful, but he had one thing they didn't: determination. He rose quickly, his weapon now aimed at the soldier closest to him. The first soldier, the one with the crimson visor, raised his own weapon, the blade humming with energy, and charged forward again. But Kalen wasn't ready to engage him in close combat. Instead, he sidestepped at the last moment, firing a concentrated blast of energy directly into the soldier's exposed side. The shot hit its mark, sending the soldier crashing into the wall with a deafening crack. For a moment, Kalen thought he had won, but before he could move, the second soldier, a hulking, heavily armored figure, rushed in with a fierce war cry. He swung his energy blade in a wide arc, aiming to cleave Kalen in two. Kalen barely managed to duck in time, the blade missing by inches. He scrambled to his feet, desperation fueling his movements. The key to the forge, the final piece, was so close, he couldn't afford to lose it. With all the strength he could muster, he surged forward, aiming a powerful shot at the soldier's exposed leg. The blast connected, and the soldier staggered back, howling in pain. But just as Kalen thought he had a chance to finish the fight, the ground shook beneath him. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. Kalen froze, his senses on high alert. The forge, something was happening. The crimson-armored soldier, who had been knocked back earlier, began to rise slowly, his armor crackling with energy. He let out a low mechanical growl. "Foolish human, you cannot stop what is already in motion." Kalen's eyes narrowed. The soldier's words were the final confirmation of his worst fear. The Dark Tide's plan had already moved beyond Ashera. This wasn't just a raid, it was part of something far larger, far more dangerous. He couldn't let them succeed. Ignoring the soldier in front of him, Kalen sprinted toward the pedestal where the key to the forge rested. His heart thundered in his chest as he reached for the artifact, its energy pulsing beneath his fingertips. The moment he touched it, a violent jolt ran through his body, but he gritted his teeth and held on. The forge had recognized him. This was the key that would allow him to activate it. The ground trembled beneath him as the dark soldiers rushed toward him. Kalen slammed the key into the pedestal, triggering a surge of energy that lit up the chamber in blinding light. The forge's power surged, and the storm outside seemed to answer, its fury intensifying. "No!" the soldier screamed, charging forward with a renewed frenzy, but it was too late. The forge had been activated. The blinding light from the forge swallowed everything, sending out shockwaves of pure energy. The Dark Tide soldiers screamed as the energy washed over them, their bodies convulsing in agony. Kalen shielded his eyes, his body trembling as the power of the forge coursed through the room, obliterating everything in its wake. When the light finally dimmed, Kalen dropped to his knees, exhausted. He looked around to see nothing but scorched earth and the crumbling ruins of the temple. The Dark Tide soldiers were gone, reduced to nothing but ash. The forge pulsed softly now, its once intense glow dimming to a steady hum. Mara and Lyra rushed into the room, both of them panting with exhaustion but alive. "You did it," Mara said, her voice breathless with relief. "You activated it. We did it." Kalen looked up at them, his eyes heavy with the weight of everything they had lost and everything they had fought for. "It's not over yet," he said quietly. "The Dark Tide will come again, and when they do, we'll be ready." As they gathered their equipment and made their way back to the Phoenix, Kalen couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope in his chest. The forge had been activated. The Dark Tide had been repelled, at least for now, but their fight was far from over, and Kalen knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The storm still raged outside, but the light from the forge had broken through the darkness. For the first time in a long time, Kalen could see a future where humanity might have a chance. It was fragile, but it was theirs to fight for. And fight they would. The storm outside raged with unrelenting fury as Callan, Mara, and Lyra made their way back to the Phoenix. The roar of the wind and the crackle of distant lightning was the only sound that filled the otherwise silent battlefield. The air smelled of burnt ozone and ash, remnants of the energy that had swept through the temple and consumed the Dark Tide forces. Callan's mind was still reeling from the battle, the sudden activation of the forge, the final confrontation in the temple. The soldiers of the Dark Tide had been defeated for now, their bodies reduced to nothing by the very power they sought to control. But Callan knew this victory would not be the end. It was just the beginning. "We've bought ourselves some time," Mara said, breaking the silence as they approached the ship. Her voice was calm, but Callan could hear the strain beneath it. "But that's all. The Dark Tide will return, and they'll come for the forge. We have to prepare for what's coming." "I know," Callan replied, his voice grim. "But this time, we won't be caught off guard. We have the forge, we know what they're after, and we'll use it." Lyra, who had been walking ahead of them, stopped suddenly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sky was clearing, the storm slowly subsiding, but something about the stillness that followed felt wrong. Her eyes narrowed, and she turned to face Callan, her expression hard. "It's not just the forge they want," Lyra said quietly. "The Dark Tide wants us to think that's the key, but it's not. The forge is a weapon, yes, but it's also a catalyst. We've activated it, but we've only seen the beginning of its true power." Callan's chest tightened. "What are you saying?" Lyra stepped closer, her voice low but filled with certainty. "The forge is connected to something far bigger. It's not just a tool, it's a bridge. A bridge to whatever is beyond this galaxy. The Dark Tide doesn't just want it for what it can do now. They want it because it's the gateway to an ancient, far-reaching power. A power that could give them the ability to conquer not just this galaxy, but the entire universe." The weight of her words hit Callan like a physical blow. He had always known the forge was powerful, but he hadn't fully understood the implications of what they had just unleashed. This was no longer just a war for survival. It was a race against time to stop an enemy that sought ultimate power. "We need to move fast," Callan said, his voice firm. "Get to the ship. We need to contact the Resistance, warn them about the forge and what it can do. We can't wait for the Dark Tide to make their next move." The trio boarded the Phoenix, and the moment they were inside, Callan ordered the ship into the air. They didn't have a destination in mind. They had to regroup, plan their next steps. The stars beyond the ship's viewport were still beautiful, distant points of light, but now they seemed colder, more unreachable than before. Mara punched a few commands into the console, her fingers flying over the controls. "The forge, it's still emitting pulses. It's not just a beacon for the Dark Tide, it's sending out a signal. The question is, who else is listening?" Callan turned to her. "You're saying it's calling someone else?" Mara nodded. "Something else. I don't know yet, but I'm getting readings on the sensors. If we don't act quickly, we could be looking at an entirely new threat, one that's already moving in." Callan closed his eyes, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. They had thought the forge was their weapon, the tool they would use to push back the Dark Tide. But now it was clear, the forge was far more dangerous than they could have imagined, and whatever force was being awakened by its activation could change the course of the war, and the fate of the galaxy forever. The Phoenix broke through the clouds and into the inky void of space. Callan looked out the viewport, his gaze fixed on the stars. The universe was vast, its mysteries infinite. The battle they had just won was only a small fragment of the larger conflict at play. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Callan had a sliver of hope that humanity might have a chance to stand against the darkness. "We'll need allies," Lyra said, her voice breaking the silence once again. "And we'll need a plan. The Dark Tide will never stop coming. But the forge could be the key to ending it all." Callan's eyes hardened. "Then we'll use it to our advantage. but this time, we do it on our terms. Mara set a course for the nearest rebel outpost, the Phoenix cutting through space at full speed. Kaelin knew they had no time to waste. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The dark tide had been beaten back for now, but they had learned something crucial. The forge wasn't just a weapon, it was a harbinger. And whatever power it called to the galaxy would come, whether they were ready or not. Kaelin clenched his fists, determination burning in his eyes. The war for humanity's survival was no longer a battle of flesh and blood, it was a fight for the future itself. And he would fight until the very end.